Well, we'll move on. How about Henry Silver, who was the expert who proved the Spalding manuscript was a source of the Book of Mormon?
Well, here's another dead end. Walter Martin jumped the gun on him. He got Henry Silver to look at the manuscript, and Henry Silver agreed that there were some similarities between the Book of Mormon and this Spalding manuscript. But he said, I'm going to have to look at it for at least a month before I can determine whether it's actually, connected. And Walter Martin, D.J. Nelson, and these guys ran around telling everybody that he had endorsed this, that Silver had said that, hey, there is a connection and we have a positive identification. And so he misrepresented Silver, and Silver came along and denounced it. Find the manuscript here. Here he says, let's see. Here he says that Silver never actually said that. In fact, Silver says right down here that he never, at the end, he decided there was no similarities between the Book of Mormon at all with the Solomon manuscript. There was no similarities at all. And so this, they really jumped the gun. He dropped out of the whole thing and refused to finish his work on it because these guys were misrepresenting him and what he said. And so again, you had another deception. Again, all of these things were being played up for the purpose of deceiving the public and making a lot of money. They would go into churches and they'd charge $25, $30 a plate, come out and make $10,000 in one night and tell these people what they wanted to hear. And yet Brother Brown was able to track all this down, and the attorney generals and the authorities and everybody else, and find out this was all fraudulent. Walter Martin also got himself in hot water here because he wasn't what he cranked up to be either. On the Mary Jane Pop show that was in California, Brother Brown confronted him right on the air about his doctorate degree. And Walter Martin says, I've got a doctorate degree in theology. And Brother Brown says, can you produce it? And he said, well, I'd have to write to somebody. And Brother Brown says, I already did. And in this statement coming back from the California University, let's see. You see here that he never even had a degree from that California Institute. This guy writes back to him, the president of the company, or the college, and says, I've never heard of Walter Martin. Now again, you have to get a hold of this book, and you can see the details what I'm talking about, because it's very alarming. Because right on the Mary Jane Pop show, he's confronted and exposed. I mean, Walter Martin had never lost a debate until he went up against a Mormon Brown. And it was just destructive to him. I mean, right on the air, everybody could see that he was a fraud, and he was hedging all the way through. You can actually get the tape, and it's unbelievable. I mean, Walter Martin actually almost broke into tears right on the program. And people, it was a call-in program, and people were calling in and saying, Walter Martin, what's wrong with you? You know, how can you say the Mormons are deceptive when you've deceived all the Christians? And he starts hammering at him about this D.J. Nelson and everything else. And say, now you don't bring that up to the Christian Institute. You don't mention Brown, or you don't mention what happened with D.J. Nelson, because they don't talk about it. They'll hang up on you. And see, this has been kind of swept under the rug, but people that were down in California have a firm memory of what happened. And so actually the book Maze of Mormonism, I'm not sure if it's around anymore, or whether they've now taken all of this stuff out because of the exposure that came out in the newspapers and whatnot. But this is a very devastating thing for these guys to get caught, because you know, here they were trying to discredit the LDS Church, and it backfired on them.
Well, I guess we'll skip the next two questions then. How about the fact that Joseph Smith was a Mason? This has never been answered.
Well, when we really look at that, again, like I said last time, we have to look at the context of that time period. The founding fathers of the United States, as I stated before, were Masons. Now, these were red-blooded Americans. Thomas Jefferson, Washington, Abraham Lincoln. And so they were not associated with some of the offshoots that we might call the Illuminati or some of these extreme Masonic groups that people attack and expose today. These were red-blooded Americans in a Masonic order that was dedicated to setting up the Constitution of the United States. And they were bringing all religions together. You know, there was Lutherans in there, there's Baptists, there's Presbyterians in there, all of them. See, now you never hear this. You got to go back in American history and do a little studying. You got to understand the European culture, and you got to understand why people came to America in the first place to get away from government religion in Europe, and why they had to form these things in order to protect themselves and keep secrets, because there was an effort in Europe to try to stop them from setting up the United States of America. And so when Joseph Smith started the Mormon Church, he had no protection. He belonged to no organization where you could get help. Now, let's say you're on the frontier and you're going down the Missouri River and you're out of food. Where are you going to go? Today, where would you go?
Salvation Army, a local church.
There was no Salvation Army back then. There was no local church you could go to for help or assistance, especially if you're a Mormon. They wouldn't have anything to do with you. If you belonged to the Masonic Lodge, they would give you protection. You could go and get food if you were in trouble. And you had some kind of a clutch. You know, America was a frontier. People don't understand that. And, you know, at the same time, nobody attacks Thomas Jefferson for being a Mason. You know, are we going to go after him and say, well, gee whiz, he was a Baptist, he was a Mason, and that makes the Baptist church look bad? Because everybody at that time knew that it was a fraternity, it wasn't a religion. And Joseph Smith and the Mormons got out of the Masons later on because they didn't like the hierarchy higher up. Because there was kind of a power structure that was beginning to form in the Masonic that we didn't like. And we got out of the Masons long before the Presbyterians and the Baptists did. They were all still in there when we left. But see, they just used that as a way to try to make Joseph Smith look not legitimate.
Okay. How do you know Joseph Smith didn't steal the handshakes from the Masons as well as the temple ceremonies?
Well, that's easy because it's documented that he had the temple ceremony 8 years before he ever became a Mason. They were doing all of those things, and they had it completely restored. And another thing, too, there is no similarities. You take a look at the Masonic Lodge. They don't practice baptism for the dead, do they? They don't practice eternal marriage. They don't practice the binding on earth of heaven. Or genealogy. They're not into genealogy. The only thing that might be similar is the handshakes. And of course now, with the Dead Sea Scrolls, those came from the Jews. You know, that's been documented by non-Mormon scholars who have deciphered the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi, that they in the temple, they shook hands with each other in order to covenant. And there was tokens and signs, all of those things that are in the Mormon Church today that people are calling a cult were part of the Jewish system back then. Now, how could Joseph Smith have known about that? How could he have set up the exact order of that, eternal marriage? And then now scholars who are not Mormons are translating that and finding out that it was just exactly the same ceremony and everything. Now, the details of it are not exact in the Nag Hammadi, but it's so close it's enough to curl your hair. If you're a Mormon and you read that, you can't believe what you're hearing. And so all of these things with the Masons, this is all a deception, another trick to get the Christians thrown off the track, thinking that this is some kind of a cult. And yet, you know, how many Christians are out reading the discoveries that have been made in the Jews? How many people know what the Dead Sea Scrolls are? How many people have read them? Well, they're not very available out there anymore, and I'll tell you why, because they're trying to cover it up. There's even a book that's out as how the experts are trying to cover up the Dead Sea Scroll findings. They don't want people to find out the corroborations with Mormonism, because they'd like to keep that, but in the LDS bookstores you can find it all.